Hello, this is author Matthew P.S. Salinas. I'm going to be sharing with you one of the 7 short stories from Mr. Salinas' 7 Scary Stories entitled The King's Silver. It was a work that I wrote partially inspired by Edgar Allan Poe and sort of the enjoyment I would have, in my younger days listening to the way that he could tell stories with a given rhyme scheme, and I found it just absolutely captivating and atmospheric. So here is my attempt at sharing something along those lines with you, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you. The King's Silver, the Dark Operetta, Act 1, The Call. The ruthless king sat on the most ridiculed of thrones. His fortunes were plenty, and his subjects but mere peasants, starving for bones. And so seasons came and went with the harvest, a year's worth of labor gone to the king, and not a soul dare contest. Castles adorned in silver, ornate and profound, were his many dwellings scattered across the kingdom grounds. Across this land avarice stalked, silently unbound. Yes, that is the reason the village folks speak, which drew up a future for our king ever so bleak. The kingdom to falter and crown to fail, empty and ruinous spaces, seeping, weeping, quiet halls. Losing the only thing he ever cared for above treasure, the entirety of what his soul saw as worth and measure. Oh yes, it is of this one resolute time I now owe to the retelling of this displeasure. Wife and daughter, along with his humanity, yet greed still stalking, sowing its fruitless insanity. There was a small tussle, in ordinary affair, between husband and wife, over the rearing of that which they had both come to care. Ill-tempered, our fair king stormed out into the night, grabbing his huntsmen, horses, and chaplains with their candles to light. Silvery armor he always wore, freshly polished and shining bright. Against the night, a shining beacon of fury was he, making haste, the king in an awful hurry, to anywhere he would rather let his rage be. Resisting the calls of his loved ones back home, committed to resolving his anger, in the woods he set out to roam. But the night raged with angered storms, all living souls taking shelter by the fire that warms. It's useless, there's nothing about, spoke the huntsman. To the dungeon, and I'll alone decide when they're out, commanded the king in a gnarled shout. Hubris was strong within him, as it was in this time of his own doubt. Feeling bold and brazen, he changed up his clout. This ornate armor, although ever worthy, I can most certainly do without. So he began to rid himself of his embroidered armor. Hubris the one who had finally disarmed him, his ever unhurt pride, which always harbored, to change the rules to any game he chose to play, all on a whim. Act 2, The Hunt. Amorous is the man's lust for pride, and so silverless did the king set out to ride. In the shining moon he swore he heard the wail of his bride. So she misses me by her side. The king mumbled, under the fullest of moons, the loneliness set in. He twirled about a closed fist, feeling that solemn silver ring. For even the cruelest of hearts can know love, despite desperate fears to hide it, beneath a scowl or a rider's leather glove. His men had turned back, so he finally took notice. Scattered, scared vermin I detest, taken to the winds as locusts. The king detests cowardice. Turning toward him, he surveyed the flooding, regretting his choices now. much more humbly. He began feeling the ill effects of the weather and the howling, refusing to admit to which he had succumbed fully. Standing stagnant upon his horse, the champion of lost recourse, he spied himself a stag. Trudging begrudgingly, he turmoiled towards, till it was too late. The claws thus sprang, and all too quick on flesh began to drag. Glaring sat two red jewels amidst the dark, attached to a howling beast whose bite far outweighed its bark. Rampaging it came, the unbound hellion, alone there the king, abandoned by his battalion. Downward he fell off his great steed, the man most noble, now left mere mortal to bleed. With no company nor men at arms, he called upon the old and trusted pagan charms. Swinging in darkness, vision scant, he leapt into that dark night, praying for a chance. And so with fangs did he meet, but thrust upon flesh, yes, his sword had found meat. A low grumble, and so it ran off. The beast of the night had been dealt enough. The king proclaimed victory against the lone wind, collapsing till found next day by knights and by kin. The hunting party executed for their sins. The king himself sent to the wise man to recover. For 2 weeks he was treated, and the wise man to treat no others. A bestial curse, began the wise man. I am perplexed. Of where? What comes next? Replied the king. It gets worse, interrupted the wise man. Out with it, man. I am disposed of, waiting on bated breaths, of what you spoke of. The king waited. The thing which struck upon you with its teeth. The wise man spoke, and stopped all of the sudden. Yes, this monstrous beast? The king had slain monsters before, hundreds, thousands. Man, underneath curse, brought forth by the moon's rise, a creature of law, though you might believe those to be lies. The wise man glared, speaking, deep in the king's eyes. I have no time for fairy tales, old man. Prepare me my feast. The king would hear no rubbish, and acknowledge no such wound to his pride. As you wish, sir. The wise man had known many a fool in his lifetime, and this, he felt, was none different. Now pardon me, said the king. My wife, I must see her. And with that, the king left. Act 3. Feast of Beasts. And yet the festival was postponed. The king had collapsed en route to the queen, and slumbered for days, fighting off symptoms rather mean. 4 weeks had passed, and the king finally got better. He sent out the invite of the feast to all by royal signed letter. The farmers and laborers he did not concern. They were strictly to observe such things. When questioned on whether or not this was something worth discern, the king was rather quick with his return. The right of reading is none of their lot to learn. So all invited came, people of noble birth and disposition, to the king's foolhardy proposition. Until the twilight they danced and partied vigorously, the king wasteful, disposing of the people's hard-earned treasury. The queen and princess present in the finest splendors, and the whole village ate of the king's company's hunting endeavors. Yet elsewhere unrest had grown in the village so oppressively held, and the laborers and the commoners had a rage that could not be quelled. Moving to the castle as night took hold, they brought torches and farm tools to keep warm in the cold. Smart enough to never play the unarmed fool. Upon the precipice of social revolution, they poised to tear asunder this tyrannical institution. As the moon held high, so they shrieked and began to pour, met not by confusion or fear, but by hundreds of people storming out the door. Caught up in vengeance, they stormed the hall for their target, and there they all stopped. Some still didn't truly believe they saw it. Others swear they'll never forget. Only the wise man witnessed it proper, the cruelest of deaths delivered from father to daughter. The princess let loose but one cry before the wolven king had gouged out her eye. One nail first plunged into the back of the skull, sending to God her innocent soul, before setting next to take feast upon her throat as a sea of crimson which upon Nyghtmares were now set afloat. A crowned wolf with a slain child in chair, dragging the queen with tooth and grip by her hair. Before she could whimper or cry for help, the wolf snapped her like a twig, a fly, a lowly, wretchless whelp. Only one who had stayed, the old wise man, advising them to all turn back. For he thought to himself, they needed now to plan. As the king clawed and set to prey upon them, the villagers took to the doors, barricading the hall. In rotation, they held it stable until day's first light, when the pounding had stopped, and so came the end to this horrendous, hellish night. Tearful he emerged, the once proud but now broken king. The wise man, he sobbed, please, just to me bring. Act 4. How the Castle Weeps. 1 month, that was all the time they were given. Construction of the monstrosity had begun, and was hell driven. Pouring all the king's silver into the fire, erecting a solid silver castle, the king's mortal prior. A demon now was he, a force of evil. Some said it was what he always would be. Hopeful for a cure, still he remained preventative. The death of his family, killed, all by his wrath. The solitude in which he sat became his only sedative. Next full moon he would inhabit this new castle, once a month for a night, just a rather inconvenient hassle. For alone was all he was now. The proximity to people didn't matter quite anyhow. The village people slaved under stern command as the edifice arose, the pooling collection of light that now illuminated their darkened land. So as the next full moon approached, the king sat ready. Upon a solemn throne of silver, so he sat steady. Yet everyone had planned differently for the widowed king. The main hall was barred up, and ultimately to his prison they did bring. He was entrapped. The king would find himself once the friends depart, and all of the laborers took bets on how long he could last. When the bestial poundings turned human, they still planned to ignore. Thus this was the master plan of the silver castle they had sought to implore. Loneliness was the cost of the crimes the king had committed, and to the silver-wrought prison he would be committed. Under one last false promise of counsel, the wise man laid him to his final rest. The king sat there, sunken his eyes, frigid his hands, unshaven his beard, and no crown upon his head. He began his prayers as the wise man left him, locking the hall door and taking the final candle to dim. To this day, never has a soul journeyed to that castle. The screams, some claim, you can hear in the darkest and quietest of evenings. Even more claim that you can hear the cries of the king, his wailing, the man who was far more beast than human, and in the solitude of the otherwise silent, solemn silver castle, stuck in perpetual night, he lies and waits. All swear they are unable to tell whether 'tis the human or the beast that is the one.